Hi. French President Emmanuel Macron recently announced that France was going to go ahead and build a new aircraft carrier. In France, this is referred to as the New Generation Aircraft Carrier, or PANG. In French, that's Porte-Avions Nouvelle Génération. And they want to build it because they know that the current aircraft carrier that they have, the Charles de Gaulle, is scheduled to hit the end of its life in the late 2030s. So if you want to have a carrier to replace the Charles de Gaulle with, you need to start building this thing now. This really isn't news. The PANG has been in the works for some time, for many, many years, but the announcement reignited once again the perennial debate that the French have been having for decades over whether or not it makes any sense for them whatsoever to have an aircraft carrier, and also a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. At first, I wanted to do a video about the French debates for and against the carriers, or carriers in general, and perhaps offer my opinion. But the deeper I got into it, the more I realized that there's something else going on. Rather, the question to carrier or not to carrier begs a host of really profound fundamental questions that go well beyond the squabbles about things like the vulnerability of large surface combatants, or whether the value or the strength of this or that naval technology and the kind of threat that it represents to any kind of ship. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about questions of grand strategy, the place of a Navy or naval doctrine within grand strategy, then how all of the above must or should inform very prosaic decisions such as how many vertical launch systems you need on your ships, or more to the point, to carrier or not to carrier. The heart of the problem is that if you can't really answer the question, what is your Navy for, you can't answer the question to carrier or not to carrier. And to a large degree, this is why navies and militaries in general often have a very difficult time figuring out what they need and deciding amongst all their different options. They have limited means, but they want all this very, very long list of stuff that they would like to have. But how do you make any decisions? They often can't make up their minds about their purpose and what they want and how all of this should fit together into some sort of comprehensive strategy, if there even is one. And of course, it goes without saying that if you don't have any kind of strategy, then all this just becomes that much more difficult. My name is Michael Shirkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana. It's a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. Now, of course, if you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. You know the drill. Also, if you really feel inspired, feel free to throw some money at my way using the thanks button here, or you could buy me a coffee using the link in the description below. You can also become a member, which will distinguish you as one of the coolest people on the planet. I suppose the argument I'm really trying to make here is that before you answer questions like to carrier or not to carrier, you have to be able to answer fundamental questions such as, what is your Navy for? In other words, you have to go back to basics. As long-term viewers know, my favorite military strategists are General André Boffre and Admiral Raoul Castex. Both more or less say the same things, albeit in different language and perhaps availing themselves of different metaphors. But it boils down to this. Number one, you have to have some sort of grand strategy for your nation's security and possibility. This is true in peace and in war, and in fact, as Boff argues very clearly, you should stop thinking about peace and war as distinctive categories. Rather, we all live in a period of peace war or war peace. I can't remember how he actually said it, but it doesn't really matter. You get the idea. Conflicts are we are always in conflict with other countries. We are always in rivalries with other countries. It's just that some of the time, and only some of the time, do these conflicts actually cross the threshold into open armed conflict. But that doesn't mean that when we're not at war, we're not competing with one another. When we're not at war, we're not doing things to each other in order to get some sort of advantage. So we're in an era of peace, war. Now, two, within the grand strategy, there are subordinate strategies that ideally should complement one another and serve the higher grand strategy. These include economic strategies, industrial strategies, diplomatic strategies, political strategies, and yes, military strategy. Military strategy is only one part, one of these elements that together comprise the grand strategy. And these things all coexist. And because they coexist and complement one another, sometimes one has to make compromises for the sake of another. These are what Castex refers to as servitudes. For example, from a purely military point of view, one might decide to spend all of one's money on gigantic battleships with wave motion engines. That will give you overmatch. You could win any battle, but from an economic point of view, in the process, you might collapse your government, which means that you should probably then rethink your naval doctrine in light of economic servitudes. Similarly, and this is one of Castex's favorite examples, you might decide that the best way for Germany in World War I was to knock out the British was to use unrestricted submarine warfare, but doing so requires ignoring the diplomatic servitude of keeping the neutral parties, above all the United States, out of the war. We all know how well that went. Within your military strategies, then, there are going to be multiple strategies which are subservient to each other and complementary. These could be ground strategies and air strategies and naval strategies, etc., depending on the situation. One of these things might be the dominant strategy, with everything else playing a supporting role. 3. Within the category of military strategies, there might be multiple strategies. These can be ground strategies, air strategies, naval strategies, etc. And depending on the context and the situation, one of these things might be the main line of effort, in which case the other strategies are supporting the main line of effort. And it all really depends. This brings us to 4. Under the category of naval strategy, things get really complicated fast because navies can do many things and serve military strategy and grand strategy in multiple ways. For example, protecting commercial shipping reflects support for an economic strategy. A commander might prefer to concentrate his fleet to hunt down the enemy fleet, but he also has to be mindful of the commercial and economic servitudes implied by the economic strategy. So many or even most ships have to be assigned to convoy duty rather than hunting down the enemy fleet and fighting it. Now, this is where we get into debates about naval doctrine. Alfred Thayer Mann believed in naval power for naval power's sake. If you want to be a major power, a great power, you have to have a big navy and have a lot of naval power, which sort of serves its own purpose. He argued that the main thing navies should focus on is fighting other navies in grand style in big decisive fleet actions on the high seas. Because if you do that, and if you can wipe out the enemy's fleet, then you can do anything else you want to do with your navy. You own the sea, which means you have sea control. So Mann was all about big fleets with really big ships one needs to fight other ships. This way of thinking is what led to the big ships of the line in the Age of Sail, and then the big steel battleships that evolved in the late 19th century, all of which culminated with the monster warships like the American Iowa class of World War II and the Japanese Yamamoto. Other theorists, namely Julian Corbett, insisted that navies are important, but ultimately wars are won on land. And whatever navies do, or what navies mostly do, is help make victory on land possible by doing all sorts of things other than or in addition to these big fleet actions. Corbett was interested in keeping open lines of communication, of being able to cut off the enemy's communications. He was interested in blocking and commerce raiding, also as a convoying. All of these things were, in his mind, equally important, which meant that for Corbett, big battleships that could duke it out with other big battleships were less of a priority than they were if you're looking at things from the optics of Alfred Thayer Mann. There are also, at the time, roughly, we're talking late 19th century, early 20th century, there was something that emerged called the Jeune École, or Young School, which basically argued in favor of not worrying about big ships at all to fight other big ship actions. Don't worry about controlling the sea. Rather, thanks to modern technology, which in those days was the torpedo, which you could then mount on a fast, small torpedo boat, you can deal with big fleets by having a large fleet of cheap, small, disposable boats that you can use not to conquer the high seas, but rather simply to defend your own ports from adversaries' big ship, to defend your littoral and your coastal waters. And at the time, also, you can send out some larger ships, cruisers, that could go out in ones and twos to raid enemy commerce. But the point is that sea control is not necessary. You don't need to empty the sea of your enemy's ships. You just need to be able to keep them at a certain distance from your coast and your ports, etc. It's a very defensive approach. Castex kind of split the difference between Mann and Corbett while also dismissing the Jeune École, but ultimately he was something of a realist. For him, building big fleets to control the seas is great. Do it if you can. But never lose sight of the fact that 1, it's neither necessary nor is it always possible, and 2, wars, it is true, are won on land. So the Navy's priority is really about helping to win the land war one way or the other, which means that because there are multiple ways of doing this, other than big fleet actions, those other ways of helping the land war become much more important in his eyes. Let's return to the subject of carriers. Carriers are heirs to battleships in that they are very large, expensive things that are thought to be decisive. You can use them for decisive action. I think the beauty of the carrier and why they and one of the reasons why they superseded the battleship is that you can use them both to support the man-esque big fleet action on the high seas in the attempt to get sea control, and to directly support action on land. I mean, battleships can do this too, but aircraft carriers are a lot better at doing this for all sorts of reasons. So they're useful. In other words, carriers are really multi-mission. You can use them for all sorts of missions and all sorts of purposes and different visions of what you need your Navy to be able to do, whether it's the sort of the big decisive sea control thing or any of the other missions that people like Corbett and Cass really appreciated. Both battleships and carriers also reflect an interest in being able to project forces often at a great distance from home. So in contrast with the Je ne call, one is thinking offensively. The idea is to fight them over there, right, and not here, keep them away from here. Is this something that makes sense for all countries to want to be able to do? Not necessarily. A few weeks ago, I published a video about the Norwegian military. I put a link somewhere up here to that, in which I argued that the Norwegian Navy's main job, if you could say that, if you have only one job, the one real thing that the Norwegian Navy needs to be able to do and do well is to help keep Russian submarines from moving from their bases in Murmansk into the North Sea and the North Atlantic. Does Norway need battleships or carriers for that? No, not at all. What it does need are smaller vessels, multiple ones, right? Smaller means you can buy more of them, that are optimized for hunting submarines. Anything else is extra. A bonus. Nice to have, but not necessary. I can more or less say the same thing for nearly all NATO countries. They don't need to worry about the high seas as much as they have to worry about the European littoral, keeping ports open, keeping open important sea lanes. None of these things really require battleships or carriers. I think that carriers are still useful for the big fleet action thing, for duking it out with another enemy's fleet. But there aren't that many enemy fleets out there to worry about. The biggest and most dangerous fleet, potential adversary, is China's. It's also the riskiest, given that in many ways China has developed all sorts of new ways to neutralize carriers at great distance, such as long-range anti-ship ballistic missiles. And I am increasingly of the opinion, though, that carriers are less and less of a good idea for the sort of man-esque vision of navies with fleet actions, is because they're so bloody expensive. And modern missile technology has made it possible for smaller vessels, frigates, to be as lethal as much larger vessels and at great range, while being also more expendable and more affordable. And then, of course, the modern nuclear attack submarines, which are impressively difficult to detect and to track. So there's a very strong argument to be made for saving your money, and instead of buying carriers, to buy more frigates and or subs. Carriers, however, remain super useful for projecting power in smaller conflicts, though admittedly the proliferation of potent drones and anti-ship missiles has increased the risk of operating these things anywhere near the shore. Here, though, frigates and subs just don't come anywhere close in terms of their ability to project power beyond the beach. This is, I think, a very good argument for France having a carrier, because France very often gets into these kinds of conflicts. As for getting into a fleet-on-fleet action, to my knowledge, the last time the French Navy has done anything like that was its war with Thailand in 1940-1941. I'm sure all of you remember the Franco-Thai War of 1940-1941. Thailand won, by the way. As I said, carriers and battleships are useful for projecting power far from home. I think it's also legitimate to ask why one might be able to, or why one might want to do that. How important is it to be able to do that? Britain and France alike both have a taste for that sort of thing, and they believe that it's in their strategic interest to do so, and to do it from time to time. But these are all debatable. These are things that people in these countries should be asking, like, why is it important for us to go and deploy a fleet to the Eastern Mediterranean and bomb someplace in the Middle East, right? Why? Why does this serve our interests? Other navies usually are content to deploy a ship or two to join some sort of distant effort. And it's less because their contribution makes any significant tactical advantage, but more because of what they want to signal by joining what's usually an American-led naval action or a European naval action. So I'm thinking of the anti piracy operations that have been going on off the coast of Somalia. I think that's a European Union effort. And then there's the effort to protect the Red Sea shipping from the Houthis. So let's say Denmark, for instance, I think they've done this in the Dutch. You'll send a frigate that will join a combined fleet, which is usually American-led, and it's useful, right? I don't want to dismiss the utility of this Danish or Dutch frigate or whatever it is, but you also need to ask, okay, does it make a big difference in terms of the success of the campaign? Not necessarily, but it's probably serving Denmark's and the Netherlands' strategic interests. It's less about whoever it is they might be bombing and more about signaling their will and their strength and the solidarity with the rest of the West and NATO and European Union and the United States. That's the strategically valuable thing, not necessarily launching missiles at any particular target or any particular enemy. Britain and France are different in that they think that it's not enough to just send a frigate or two to some sort of operation like this, but an entire carrier battle group. France, in fact, sent the Charles de Gaulle carrier to bomb Afghanistan. It has also sent it to the Eastern Mediterranean to support anti-ISIS activities in Syria and Iraq. It sent the Charles de Gaulle to Libya to participate in the NATO air campaign there. The UK has done the same thing. It sent its new remember. They sent HMS Queen Elizabeth in 2021 to conduct air attacks in Syria and in Iraq against ISIS targets. French participation and British participation make this allied effort more successful? It's really debatable. Would it have made a difference if France had not sent its carrier or the British had not sent Queen Elizabeth? Probably not. Can you make a case that sending a full-blown carrier rather than just a frigate does more to advance French or British interests than simply sending a frigate, right? So where's the strategic value and strategic advantage in doing that? Does it get more strategic value? Does it serve French strategy more than simply sending a frigate? And if it does, is it sufficiently more to justify the considerably larger expense of sending a carrier as opposed to a frigate? And how do you even answer that question? How can you put a number to this? This is part of the challenge. You're going to assert, yeah, this is a useful thing to do, but how useful is it really? And how valuable is that? The French haven't used the Charles de Gaulle in any sort of existential context. It's not saved France, right? The way, you think about the U.S. Navy carriers in the War of the Pacific. That's how we won the war. It's not like that. It's not how France or England has won these wars off of Libya or something like that. No, the value has something else. The value is more about the signaling, the politics, the will, demonstrating the capacity and the capability. Indeed, the French reckon that if they don't have a nuclear carrier, they risk losing rank. And that's something that they say explicitly in the documents. For instance, there's a 2021, I think, report published by the French Senate that really is this long report that basically it all makes the case for having a nuclear carrier. And they use the word rank, rang, very, very clearly. We risk losing rank. This is then all about counting among the really big boys. And even if, the French understand that compared to the U.S. Navy, the French Navy is nothing. I mean, France has one carrier. The United States has 11 nuclear carriers, and not just 11 nuclear carriers. The United States actually has 9 conventionally powered aircraft carriers. We don't call them carriers. We call them amphibious assault ships, but they are aircraft carriers. They can and do carry F-35Bs. Before that, they had Harriers, meaning that all told, the United States has 20 carriers to France's one carrier. So what difference does one carrier make? How valuable is it to a nation to be able to say, hey, look at us, we have a nuclear carrier? What's the value of that? And then when you're trying to make decisions about where do you spend your money, frigates, subs, this, that, the other thing, how do you put a price tag, or how do you, in your spreadsheet when you're trying to come up with the balance, like does this come out advantageous? How do you weigh these things compared to all the others, or compared to like the opportunity costs of not building more frigates? I just want to add to this that both France and the UK value their carriers explicitly because it enables them to interoperate closely with the Americans in a way that other countries cannot. For example, when HMS Queen Elizabeth in 2021 did combat missions off of Iraq and Syria, both British and American F-35s operated off of Queen Elizabeth. It was a combined effort. The British looked at that and they thought this was priceless strategically, that they could host U.S. Marine Corps F-35s and they could have Americans doing this, and thus they're being helpful to the Americans. For the British, that's really important, and that serves their strategy arguably more than whoever it was they were bombing at the time. Similarly, the French and the U.S. Navy, or the French make a point of their high degree of interoperability with the United States Navy, the fact that U.S. Navy F-18s fly off of the Charles de Gaulle and French Rafale from the Charles de Gaulle have swapped and flown off of U.S. carriers. It's something that they practice, they do on exercises. To my knowledge, U.S. Navy F-18s have never flown a combat mission off of the Charles de Gaulle, but they totally could. And the fact that they could pleases the French very much. So part of what the French are paying for when they build these carriers, and the British when they're building these carriers and these air wings, is the ability to be useful in American eyes. At least that's what they're hoping. And then to have a seat at the table whenever there's a conflict. What is that worth? How much is that worth? And I don't really believe there's an answer to that, and that's really the problem. The French, by the way, to be very clear also, they're not thinking just about combat power. This Charles de Gaulle and the future PANG represent far more to them than simply the combat power that this thing is going to represent. The carrier, nuclear carrier, represents industrial might and sophistication. The fact that France can build a nuclear carrier is a really big deal. Only France and the United States have nuclear-powered carriers. Only France and the United States can build them, although the Chinese are working really hard on it, and probably in the 2030s will have one. So this is a very exclusive club. Also, as the French like to emphasize, all of the technology and the machinery on the new aircraft carrier, like the Charles de Gaulle, will be French-made. It's 100% made in France, with the exception of the catapults and the arresting gear, which France is obliged to buy from the United States because this stuff is just too expensive and takes too long to develop on their own. So okay, this they'll buy from the Americans. All of this is very important for France's self-image. It reflects how they want to perceive themselves. And in that way, it reminds me of the mirror of Erised in Harry Potter, right? That shows you your deepest and most desperate desire. That's what the new carrier is. Whether or not other people perceive them in the same way is an entirely different question. So back to the question of grand strategy. The way the French talk about the carrier, there clearly is a grand strategy at work here. The strategy, though, has less to do with any particular military capability or particular use of a navy. It's not about man or Corbett. Now, that's fine, because remember, grand strategy is not about military strategy or naval doctrine or anything like that. Those things are all supposed to be subordinate to the grand strategy. Here, the grand strategy seems to have to do more to do with securing France's future by, among other things, insisting on a status that will, the theory is, serve France's future, and that this status is associated with France's ability to bomb whomever it wants, so that group, right, and not just bomb people, not just being able to project force, but to do it with a tool that only France, the United States, and soon China has. That's really the strategy here, this idea that this is the status. That's what really matters. That's what serves French national interests, not defeating any particular insurgent group or terrorist group or anything like that. I mean, all of that is nice, and for each instance, you can come up with a military strategy and a naval strategy for dealing with ISIS or dealing with, I don't know, whomever you want to deal with, or thinking about the Chinese, etc. But here, the priority is on the status. The priority is on everything that the French believe that having this carrier confers. I would say, or to add to that I think there's this idea of wanting to message to the United States, that while France can never pretend to have parity with the United States in terms of military power, at least it can claim to be a valued member, a valued partner, a valued coalition partner, and somebody who deserves a seat at the table, meaning somebody who hopefully, ideally, will have a voice, will have some sort of influence over how things transpire, over what happens, rather than simply being in the passenger seat, rather than simply being sort of the passive, just riding along the way I think other NATO countries arguably do. If you're Denmark or the Netherlands, you don't really have a voice. You're really passive. You're in the passenger seat, and the United States is driving for better or for worse. What France wants to do is they want to have, if not a turn at the wheel, then at least, they want to be able to ride, to have some input into where this thing is going. If that's the strategy, I mean, is that a good strategy or a bad strategy? I don't really know. But if you think it is a good strategy, then the $10 billion price tag for the new PANG kind of seems worth it. Thank you very much. I hope you liked this video. If you look in the description, you'll see links to my social media, Twitter, X, Blue Sky, LinkedIn, also my Substack, also called Pax Americana, and my website, michaelshirkin.com. Thank you very much for your support. Please stay tuned. There's plenty more in the pipeline. Bye-bye.